Good morning. Thank you all for being here today. I hope this is a fun talk for all of you. This morning we'll be talking about what is the key to creating a beautifully productive garden, thinking beyond your raised beds. Cheeky title, thinking outside the box. This talk will briefly outline design principles for siting an edible garden, and then we'll dive into concepts for boosting both the production and aesthetics of your garden by integrating it into the surrounding area. Hopefully you'll glean ideas from making structural additions to selecting perennial plants for improving your edible garden via its surrounding area. I'm hoping that this talk will resonate with those of you who are building new gardens or are interested in improving your existing garden, both aesthetically and productively, by implementing changes to your larger landscape. I wanted to start this morning by asking who here already has an edible garden. Sure, think everything's edible. And how many of you are planning to create a new edible garden this year or? Awesome. Okay. So I'm going to start this morning by briefly going over some design principles for siting an edible garden for those of you who are starting from scratch. And I'll try to also plug in some tips for those of you who have existing gardens, if there are things that you want to check to make sure your productivity is as good as it can be. So obviously sun is where we start. You want a minimum of 8 hours during the growing season. And for obviously here, we're looking really from spring to fall equinox. And I have an app that I love to use called Sun Seeker. And it shows you, gives you a live feed of those sun angles, equinox, solstice, and both solstices, and then even today's sun. So if it's a cloudy day, you can still see where the sun should be. And it can be really handy, especially if, for example, all of a sudden your existing garden is starting to get shaded out and you're trying to think, what if I lived a couple branches up? If you stand at your raised bed and guide the Sun Seeker towards that tree, it'll show you where the sun arc is tracking, and it can be a really handy tool for maintaining trees around your existing garden, but also siting a new garden. After you've procured some good sun, I always like to think pretty early on about access to the garden. I encourage clients to always site their edible garden near the house, ideally close to their kitchen. I find that the closer that your veggies are to your kitchen with a small scale garden, the more likely you are to run out and actually grab something to cook with. And in terms of access within the garden, I always encourage people to, if there is space, to create 3-foot pathways, so you can always get a wheelbarrow through for easier access within your garden. The next element is climate or microclimate, making sure you're thinking about winds, where you might have excess heat or cold when you're siting your garden. You might have a really nice, sweet, hot spot on your property that would be great for a garden. Next is water, making sure that you can get water to your garden, ideally, if you're able to. Having a hose bib and a drip irrigation system, and you always want to have your annual crops on a different drip irrigation system than your perennials because they'll have very different watering needs. And I highly recommend water catchment. If you're able to invest in that, it's my #1 recommendation at this point in time where we are with climate change for all clients. And Huck Phillips does an amazing job of setting up both catchment and irrigation here in Lopez. Then, of course, your soil is very important. And I encourage people, even with older existing gardens, to test both your pH and soil nutrients every few years. I like to use the Soil Test Farm Consultants out of Moses Lake. So it's a really fun and simple process to send a soil test into them. And because it's so close to us, they get your info back to you really quickly. There definitely was a bit of a lull in terms of getting reports back during COVID, because so many people were sending in soil tests, but so far this year, everything's come back really quickly. So highly encourage using soil test farm consultants if you want to figure out what you can do to amend your specific garden beds. Then protection, of course, we need deer protection here and rabbit protection. This garden up above is a newer garden down near McKay Harbor that we did a solid fence on the north side to protect the winds from the bay, coming off the bay, and then the deer and rabbit fencing on the south side there so that we're not blocking much sun. And then next we have rotation. I always recommend a minimum of 3 raised beds so that you can get your minimum crop rotation in. I think if you were to actually break down your raised beds for every annual plant family, you need like 8 raised beds. And for most of us, that's a lot, unless you're actually farming. But 3 is great because you're able to move through a lot of, give your soil enough time to rest, especially for things like tomatoes and alliums that might have some soil-borne diseases. Let them have some time to rest for 2 years in between crops. So in this garden, you can see there are 3, it's a little hard to see, but there are 3 4x8 raised beds, and then there are 2 4x4 raised beds in between them. And the 4x4 beds are for herbs and flowers. And then the 3 4x8 raised beds are for the rotation of 3 crops, or 3 groups of crops. So each year, this year, I actually just planted this garden for the first time last week and just literally moved everything over a bed. It makes thinking about, you only have to think about companion planting that first time, and then you just move things right along, and it made planting this year go really quickly. Along those same lines, I always like to think about order within the gardening, creating some organization and balance, and pairing that with crop rotation does exactly that. And that also really ties into the other design principles of repetition, creating predictable patterns and sequences and a consistent palette. These raised beds are juniper, which is highly rot resistant. And right now, Sunset actually has these same 6x6 juniper timbers. They're sustainably harvested out of Oregon. They are quite expensive now. When I first started using them over a decade ago, they were cheaper than a 2x6 of cedar. It was incredible, but people have caught on, so they're a bit more expensive now, but so worth the investment, because not only are you going from 2x to a 6x, so you've got 3 times the longevity just from that. Also, they're a rough cut, so they're a true 6 inches, not 5.5. And juniper is even more rot resistant than cedar. So these garden beds should last decades and decades. So if you're thinking about, I find that typically 2x6 cedar raised beds last about a decade. These should last, I would imagine, at least 3 decades, if not 5. They only got a single pallet in, but there is a pallet at Sunset right now if anyone is looking to build raised beds, and I can't recommend them enough. And they gray out. This picture was taken within just a couple months of installing the garden, and look how beautifully they've already grayed out really quickly. And then with the idea of repetition, we found a stain for the fencing that kind of, we weren't exactly sure exactly what color they were going to gray out to, but we did stain the fence, and I think it turned out really beautifully that they're very much a consistent color. And once everything grows in, there'll be visually a lot more interest going on with all that gray, but creates a really beautiful backdrop, I think. Another key element is proportion, creating a spatial relationship between elements. They're throughout this garden, with the exception of the far end over here, which is open, which is now has a potting area in it. That's why that's left open. All these pathways all the raised beds are the same. They're all either 4x4 or 4x8, as I mentioned. All the pathways are the same measurements. So when you're working throughout the garden, not only does it look really nice, but you're less likely to accidentally walk into a bed, because as you're walking, everything is really consistently spaced. So when you're carrying a big flat of plants, it's really intuitive to know where you're going. And the last element that I like to think about when I'm designing an edible garden is just overall unity and the connectedness of elements, and again, consistent aesthetics. So all of the second half of those, the first half of those elements are really what I like to call more site-based site analysis elements, and then the second half are more design elements. And you can see how much they really work together, and a lot of them are the same in many ways. So now let's dive into how you, that's pea gravel, which I would not recommend as my top choice, because as you walk, you sink down into it. I would personally recommend either wood chips or more of a crushed gravel, or even something like 5/8 would be fine, but that way it's not giving way every time you walk, but it is very beautiful. And my client preferred it, so. Yes, very hard to push a wheelbarrow through. Not very functional, but very beautiful, so. But I find that even after I went and planted this week, I was kind of using my foot to fill in the holes that I created just from walking around. So I would recommend either a sturdier gravel, or wood chips are nice just because they are softer on your joints, which even at 40, I'm appreciating, so. Okay, so how do you integrate a raised bed garden into the landscape? This is an example from a garden I designed when I was working for Seattle Urban Farm Company. So this is, you can see the urban context of their next door neighbors are right there behind me. But this was a series of Core-10 steel raised beds that I designed, and to keep them from looking like they were just floating in the yard, we did two different things here. One was, you can see we created we oriented them different ways to create some visual interest. And then we created a patio and seating space over on this side that winds around the raised bed. So you're with a little bench there. So you're actually able to, my client will set her, harvest basket there, or her gardening tools there when she's gardening, so it gives her a space to set that down. But she said it's also just a really lovely place to sit when her grandkids come to visit and they're picking things out of the raised beds. They'll sit there and have a little snack. So that's a structural element. And then you can see we've just surrounded a lot of the beds with a softening aspect of different perennial plants, both beneficial flowers and edible perennials, to tuck that in. So that's just kind of an initial thought to start with. So when you're looking to integrate your edible garden into your greater landscape, here are a few design concepts for integration. And I like to think both spatially and then the roles that plants can play. So spatial consideration for both built elements, structural elements, and plants. Think about addressing both your vertical and horizontal planes. Try to soften edges, and try to ground very large and tall elements. And sometimes that is even your house. Then thinking about plants specifically outside of the raised beds, the three main plant groups I like to look to are edible perennials, beneficial perennials in an ornamental sense, and then native beneficial perennials for pollinator habitat. So that's what we'll talk about today. For spatial considerations, built elements could be as simple as adding this trellis to your raised bed, something permanent. This one I thought was a pretty cool design. We actually just found this online. We had this really tall facade of the house, which created a wonderful heat sink for the raised beds. But you just to the side there, you walk up to the front porch to enter the house on a second level, and that wall was pretty ominous as you were sitting gardening with your 18-inch tall raised bed down below. So we added these trellises, and I mean, they worked out just about perfect in terms of their height. Once we anchored them to the beds. And what's really fun is once we started growing things there, we'd had peas climb up and pole beans, and we tie off sunflowers to those. And then as my client was sitting up on her deck, those things would be kind of down at foot level, which was really neat. And this was a pretty darn simple, you know, we ordered them online and it took less than an hour to install, and it made such a huge impact in the garden moving forward. It was really wonderful. So that's one quick built element example. And then for plants, this is a garden here on Lopez that the edible garden is in a driveway roundabout, and we've surrounded the whole edible garden with a beneficial perennial flower garden. So it looks really gorgeous, even, you know, in the off season, as you drive in and drive the loop around the garden. You've got plants there softening the edge of all the deer and rabbit fencing. So you're not just driving right along a fence. Let's look a bit more at some built elements. So the list is very long of what you can do with built elements. So these are just a few brainstorm ideas, but again, thinking about both vertical planes and horizontal planes. And again, grounding large elements. So this is a project built by Thomas Fragnoli that's down. This is actually the same property as that first juniper raised bed project. And we started with these raised beds here, and Thomas Fragnoli did such a beautiful job building them that we thought, oh, I don't know about putting the edible garden in here. Let's put some really gorgeous perennials in instead. And so we ended up adding the whole garden that you saw down on the other side of the property, where it was actually sunnier and a really good fit. But these raised beds were a wonderful way to mediate the height of the building and integrate it into this outdoor seating area. So you can see that this first raised bed along the driveway actually it kind of splits the facade of the house so that it's not floating out beyond the house. It actually, part of it is aligned beyond the house, and the other part is actually right alongside. I don't know if that's making sense, but you essentially, it overlaps, I guess would be a better way to say it. So it helps, especially once the plants grow in, and it really helps nestle and ground the structure in a really beautiful way. And then Thomas Fragnoli also built these really wonderful little seats and benches into the garden bed. So you're able to sit right next to the garden bed. And that bed has a bunch of really aromatic flowers in it. Some agastache and lavender and other things. And so it smells so wonderful to sit there. And there's a rosemary right on the other side. And they're also, the beds frame the overall horizontal space of the big patio that was constructed out there. So they bookend the patio and kind of hold the space so that when you're sitting, gathering there, you feel really nestled in by the plantings. And that's something you can do with your annual garden as well, is use your raised beds to create some outdoor gathering space. Here's another project on the south end by Alec Bay. And this is constructed by JAS, Design Build. And talking about the ground plane, this was a really fun way to totally rethink the ground plane. So we went with in-ground beds instead of raised beds, and did these poured in place 2x6 pavers that actually extended beyond the garden beds, so that you can, walk past them. And it was just a really fun, kind of different way of creating a garden bed. The bed furthest out into the lawn, we should have really flipped these, but this is what the client wanted to do. The annual crops should have been out there, but they're tucked against the house. And so we do more lettuces and herbs, and try sadly to grow tomatoes that are never quite happy enough. You can see them in their little cloches there. But we have a cutting garden, a flower cutting garden, a blueberry bed, and then the annual crops right along the house, along with some chives there in the corner. But it's just a really, really fun way to rethink creating garden beds. And then this is the first edible garden I ever designed on Lopez. This is my mother's garden. And she won't like the fact that I'm using a picture of what it looks like right now is my plant staging area, since we're in temporary housing with them right now. So I've got some plants, and actually that little conifer is going to the plant sale. That's their live Christmas tree from the holidays, and it's a really hefty plant. So hopefully it gives a good price at the plant sale. Anyway, so this is the series of it's a little hard to see, but it's a series of 9 raised beds. And Sean Westervelt with Ascent built these sheds. They're based off of the Modern Shed Company in Seattle, but they were so back ordered that my mom just asked Sean, could you just build these for us? He said, yes, of course. So he built these sheds, and we used them to frame the garden space. And one of them is the one with the red door is the garden shed, and then the other is just a storage shed. But what they do, they're on the water side, and they help it. This is the hottest spot on the property to begin with, but then they create this wonderful microclimate by blocking the wind, capturing some morning heat off of the eastern sun, and then actually creating some shade at the end of the day. When it does get really hot in the summer there, I swear this, go out to that garden and it sometimes seems 10 degrees hotter than our house right down the street. So, so they create a wonderful microclimate, and we also use them to aesthetically frame the garden. So you can see you walk in between the sheds with all my stuff that's clogging the entryway right now, but through this beautiful gate framed on an old apple tree, and the posts actually used to be there was a tree struck by lightning on their property that they saw the strike happen. And so we actually gently felled the tree and took the lightning strike pieces, and they were actually the fence posts for about 15 years, and they just rotted out and had to be replaced. But it was pretty poetic, because then the rest of the tree, when you were walking out the garden, the felled log as a massive bench was right there. So you could see, it was maybe overly poetic, but it was pretty cool. And so you walk in, and there's a series of 4x4 raised beds that you're looking at there through the gate. And then on either side are a series of, we've just redone this all in juniper. It was originally cedar. They lasted probably about somewhere between 10 and 15 years, and then needed to be replaced. So we redid them all with 2x6 juniper last year. And so in the view, the horizontal view where you're looking into the garden, that's actually the new juniper. And then this other close up with the kale and the peas, that's actually the original cedar there. And you can see, so this shed, it has a great walkthrough, so you can get the mower and stuff out from outside the garden. And then my mom's potting bench is right inside the sliding door that on the inside of the garden, but it's great because you can just use it as a pass through. So it's a really smart design that Sean put together for that shed. But this is just a great way to think about using structures and sheds to help frame a space that also, if you need a shed anyway, it's a great way to do just a little less fencing. So I do encourage people to either use, whether it's a part of, a side of their house to start fencing off of, or sheds. It's just a great way to integrate your garden into the already built environment of its context. So we're going to look at a case study that's kind of a dreamer case study, a little bit larger scale garden. This is a garden that I designed for the Seattle Urban Farm Company for a chef in Seattle. And this is on Mercer Island. And he really wanted to be able to produce a lot at home, but then take it to his restaurants. And his big dream was to have a greenhouse, and a greenhouse that could function both to grow things, but then also to actually use it to teach some cooking classes in the garden, so that they could literally be harvesting and bringing things right in and cooking, which was really incredible. Especially when you have the budget to do that. So I'll kind of toggle back and forth between, here's a plan view of the site. And so the photo, you're looking from the street along where the pathway kind of kicks out, that's where that view is taken. And so you've got the big greenhouse in the center of the garden, and then a huge outdoor table for gathering for, I mean, it's like the biggest, best potting table you've ever seen, but it also can hold a lot of people for beautiful outdoor dinners. And then the greenhouse, even though it's transparent, creates a little bit of a buffer between the road and the table when they are eating outside. And so in terms of built elements, we obviously added the greenhouse, and you can see trellising that we did use this taller trellising type to, again, create, I mean, he's producing for restaurants. We were trying to produce as many things as possible for him. But also that larger scale trellis just works really nicely to pair with the greenhouse. Have something else tall in the garden, especially as our perennials were still growing up around the edges. We also mixed raised bed materials. So this is 2x6 juniper that you're seeing. And then we faced the pathways with corten steel plates. And then there are a few beds in the garden. The cutting bed garden that you see or the cutting flower garden to the north of the greenhouse in the plan, those are all steel beds. And then along the path, the whole south side of the garden is all for annual crop production for the restaurants. And we faced each bed along the path with a corten steel plate, so that as you're walking down the path, you see that corten on both sides of the path. It looks really beautiful, but is a fraction of the price of doing the entire garden in corten. What else? We brought in some of these big boulders just to frame the entryway and make sure that no one would inadvertently drive off the road into the garden. But it was nice to add, something else really, the greenhouse, again, even though it's transparent, carries a lot of visual weight in the landscape. And so bringing in a couple of big boulders just helped ground the site a bit. There's also what you can't see just out of view here is a little farm stand as well, where any excess produce that the restaurants aren't going to use just goes out to the farm stand, and it was just for neighbors to take to share with the neighborhood. And then we did encircle the whole garden with perennial plantings, as you can see, and there's a rain garden down in the southeast corner, and we did berm up a bit along the road to add some topography to nestle in the garden a bit. And wherever we could, we included both edible perennials and beneficial perennials, and a lot of native plants as well, to kind of create some nice habitat outside of a really, really intensive built environment. But I think it turned out really beautifully, and was, it's been a few years since I've been in touch with this client, but was really productive, and he was having a lot of fun with it. And his team was having a lot of fun getting to harvest from there. Yes. That's a good question. I mean, they're like close to 8 or 10 feet tall.
So if being would ever come all the way up.
Yes, correct.
And then I noticed there are vertical springs.
Yes, we prefer to use the string method for both tomatoes and pole beans in particular. Lets a lot more air circulation in. I think it's more of a farming, the farmers will be able to comment on this. I think it's, more of a larger scale farming method, and less likely to use in your home garden, but it really helps with air circulation. And so it is our preferred method for, like I said, both tomatoes and pole beans. And the pole beans in particular just do their own thing and climb right up there. The tomatoes, you have to, work them a little bit more, but not too terribly much. Okay, so now let's talk about plant elements. So similarly, thinking spatially, but this time about plants rather than constructed elements. And I really like to still utilize the principles of thinking about vertical planes and horizontal planes, softening the edges and grounding larger elements. This is another view of my mom's garden. And we've planted hops on the north and south fence. Actually, there's actually a dog run in between the garden and the far south fence. So we're not blocking any light because there's about a 10-foot space there. But these hops, oh my gosh, they put on that growth in a single season. And they look stunning. They really soften the garden. They block the neighbor's shed that's right on the other side of that almost green wall, if you will. And it just is a lovely addition to the garden and just, yeah, really softens the space. It again creates a bit of a microclimate. So now you've got more or less, I mean, obviously some breeze is getting through there, but you've got almost a solid wall on two sides of the garden now on the north and west. So really creating some nice microclimate there.
Did the deer eat them?
I would assume so. This is all, and they're planted on the inside of the fence, but then the whole property is also deer fenced. But so I would recommend protecting them. Does anyone have hops not protected? Okay, yeah, that would be my impression.
On the hops
Mhm.
is that they are completely invasive as the planting sound, and I fought them for a long time. I really would love to know the care, because they will go everywhere underground, like 6 feet underground, pop up, and I think I call them kudzu. So I'm just wondering how you're preventing them from taking over everything.
That's a great question. The question was how to keep them from keep all their runners in check with how much they grow. And so on the inside of the garden here, we have really heavy duty landscape fabric, like essentially what you put under a road, not what you buy at Sunset. But really heavy duty landscape fabric, which is what we use in projects under the gravel there. And so that's keeping it from going into the garden. And then on the immediate other side of the fence is mowed all the time. So the mowing keeps it in check on the outside. And so between the mowing and the landscape fabric, it definitely trails all along, fills in really nicely along that fence line where it's allowed to come up. But between the heavy duty landscape fabric, we haven't had any issue with it coming into the garden. And mowing has so far kept it in check with it being out of the garden. And we also have them, I have them in a couple of other gardens, and really similarly, as long as we are maintaining either edge, like they fill in really rapidly where they're allowed to come up, but as long as you're either mowing or have really heavy landscape fabric or hardscape on either side. So far, that's worked.
The roots can get like an inch and a half around. I get up and saw underground. I talked to Jessica before you. For me.
So take caution if you plant them. But vines are a really wonderful way to create that vertical element in your garden and utilize the fencing that you already have up. And I find that for the most part, any vine, if you are planting it on the inside and, maybe not right on the inside, but maybe a few extra inches in. And also if you are being a diligent Lopez gardener and rabbit fencing along the bottom, then the deer aren't able to get their muzzles through to nibble on that fresh new growth. So that really helps. But as long as they're planted on the inside of the fence, and not right on the inside, but a few extra inches in, any vine should do pretty well. Obviously, they'll nibble on what's on the outside, but you just keep encouraging it to stay on the inside of the fence. That'll help. So I mentioned earlier the three main plant categories that I utilize in my work in terms of perennials to soften and surround and really activate your edible garden, or edible perennials, beneficial perennials, and really specifically native plants for pollinators. So I've created a whole edible perennial glossary which I'd be happy to send out if people want a copy of it. And I created this a long time ago, and so some things have changed. The unusuals category, I would hope that everyone here knows everything in it because they're not so unusual anymore. And I feel like Lopez Gardens are ahead of the curve anyway. But the main categories that I look to are to help me think again, vertically, horizontally, all these different layers, trees, shrubs, ground covers, vines, the quote unquote unusuals, herbs, flowers. And then I've also created a special list of shade tolerant things so that you're not bound by a single sunny location. And then also a page on Northwest natives that are more thought as foraging plants, but I really encourage people to get them into their perennial gardens. So we'll just look quickly through this. There's so many options out there, but this is kind of a visual glossary that I use as a starter place with clients to start the brainstorm of what could I add to my garden. And trees are really, for me, the #1 place to start, especially if you have any space within a fenced area. And I always encourage people to plant what you love eating. Obviously, apples and pears do really well here, but if there's something you really love eating, try it out. There are so many varieties of different fruiting trees that cultivars have been developed that will do well in our climate. So that's always my go-to comment is, well, what do you like eating? What do you like harvesting? Well, you know, what are you actually going to go outside and harvest? And then thinking from the tree layer down to the shrub layer, there are so many fun berries to work with, including a lot of native berries. And then thinking about the ground plane, lots of different strawberry options always. And then there are also a lot of different, you know, there are dwarf blueberries. Then you can start thinking about not just edible for you, but edible for the birds. And vines, as I mentioned before, these are kind of the most common things that I plant. The passion fruit is such a gorgeous flower. You know, it doesn't always fruit here, but gosh, what a fun flower to have in the garden. And kiwi, there's so many different versions of kiwis now. It's really, really fun, from the super teeny ones to the big ones. Those grow so well here. Here's the unusual page, which I said is not looking so unusual 10 years after putting this together. Saffron is always a really fun one because you only need such a teeny amount. And I love both artichokes and cardoons in the landscape. They look just stunning. And I always encourage people to let them go to flower because the bees really, really love them. So at least let a few go to flower. Herbs are so fantastic for so many different reasons. A lot of them are also great pollinators, especially the perennial herbs. They're a great way to add structure to your garden while still having it be edible, especially year-round structure with things like rosemary and lavender. Here, a few more specific pages, some shade-tolerant options so that if you do have a more wooded site, there are still things you can plant and harvest. I find that often they just, you know, may produce a little less or a little later in the season, but they'll still produce. And I've found evergreen huckleberry to be quite deer tolerant as well. And slough once it gets going. So those are things that you can have out. And then some native options, and you see lots of crossover between these pages. So then the next category of plants that I really look at are beneficial perennials. And this is, again, kind of an older list. And I have a version of this handout today if you'd like to take it home with you. One side for shade and one side for sun. And beneficial perennials are great for so many different reasons. They obviously attract beneficial insects, both pollinators and otherwise, to increase pollination in your garden. They do an amazing job of adding color and texture to your garden. Really fun way to, with all the varieties out there, to select just the color palette you want for your garden. And they're, again, a really wonderful way to soften edges, ground built elements, and define the different planes of your garden. I love using annual beneficial flowers like nasturtiums and alyssum to spill out of the raised beds to soften the sides of the beds, and have so many photos of hummingbirds and nasturtiums that I could give a whole presentation on that, but it's such a fun way to bring some wildlife into your garden. And just a reminder to think beyond, this is obviously kind of the starting place for beneficial perennials, but a reminder to go think beyond perennial flowers to include those other planes of trees and shrubs and vines and ground covers. And a great way to do that is to start thinking about native plants that are great for pollinators. And a few notes on why native plants are so important for pollinators. This is kind of a no-brainer, but native plants attract native pollinators. They've, so to speak, grown up together. They've adapted together, and native pollinators, their home are native plants. Over 90% of native insects cannot complete their life cycles without native plants. That's a statistic that really blew my mind when I first read it. It's so high. Native plants are also 4 times more alluring to native bees than exotic flowers are. So again, they're used to their homes, and they're attracted to their home plants. And native plants are obviously, for the most part, adapted to provide the best habitat for native pollinators, and are, for the most part, proving to be really resilient in these times of climate change. I could next year give a whole talk on this, because last month I did give one class just on this page. But a few key tips are that you're always wanting to provide pollinators with 3 things: food, water, and shelter, and thinking about that throughout the seasons and throughout their life cycles, because certain pollinators will have a very short life cycle and other pollinators will have a longer life cycle. There's some that overwinter, there's some that do not. And so but those are the big 3. If you can give them food, water, and shelter, you'll be going really far. And the biggest thing for native bees, just to plug this, is bare soil in your garden, with no landscape fabric, no mulch. I'm gonna forget the percentage right now, maybe Debbie knows, but it's something like 70% of our native bees are ground dwelling bees, and they will not ground well in mulch, and they cannot get through landscape fabric. They want just bare soil that's not going to get too muddy. So you want to find a spot back behind maybe one of your favorite plants where that's bigger and bushier, where you can just leave an open spot, especially if it's a pollinator flower, for them to dwell in. Another tip is that butterflies do love mud puddles, and they actually get a lot of their nutrients from mud puddles. They will drink the mud, and actually a lot of the minerals that they intake from their diet are from mud puddles. So it's a little counterintuitive for people who like tidy gardens, but mud puddles are great for a lot of pollinators, but especially butterflies, and bare soil is very important for our native bees. So just 2 specific plugs there, but this is another list that we can send out an email if you'd like, of native plants for pollinators. And I've broken this down by season so that you can think about having a plant, if not multiple, in every season to try to create a consistent pollinator habitat from February through about November, and then hopefully everyone's asleep in December and January. And each one of these sections includes, for the most part, everything from a tree down to a ground cover. So again, thinking it across these different planes, what trees could you have on the north side of your garden that are going to bloom throughout the seasons to be drawing pollinators to your garden? And then on the south side, so you won't block any sun, what ground covers could you put in, or smaller perennials, smaller shrubs, so that you're drawing pollinators into your garden? And that's a great way to just really basic thinking, tall things on the north side and small, short things on the south side. And a lot of these native plants, once they're established, have some deer tolerance, which is great. I do recommend caging everything for at least 2 years if it's a perennial, and like 3 to 5 years if it's a shrub or a tree. and then probably still caging just the trunk of the tree to keep the bucks off of it in mating season. But a lot of fun plant options here, looking at natives. Just a few highlights. My favorite plant right now every year is Oregon grape. It's just, if you've never smelled it, watch your nose, but smell the Oregon grape. It smells so divine, absolutely lovely. In gardens where I have a lot of it, I now use it as a cut flower. And it's funny because if you cut all the holly-like leaves off, people say, "Oh my gosh, what is that flower? It's so gorgeous." And then you tell them it's Oregon grape and show them what you cut off the stem, and they're kind of blown away if they don't recognize it. But it smells phenomenal. The bees are so happy about it right now. I include it around a lot of gardens, any client that's interested in both growing food and native gardens. This is just about my first go-to plant to put in. And then in terms of, if there was one native flower that you were to add to your garden, I would encourage you to add the Douglas aster, which you can see there at the bottom of the screen with a butterfly on it. It can bloom for so many months if the weather is right, from sometimes like June or July all the way through November. Like last year, it bloomed so late because it was so warm and mild for so long. And Oregon State has done some amazing pollinator studies that I've followed really closely, and that I could, again, do a whole talk about next year. But just to plug this one plant, they did this really cool study where they took, to try to get people to think, again, beyond just putting lavender in for your beneficial perennial flower. And they took a control of a dozen really classic garden plants like lavender that people think of as your beneficial flowers. And then they took 36 native plants. And for 3 years, they studied to see and observe two things: how many pollinators came to visit each species, and then what diversity of pollinators came to each species. And obviously lavender attracted a lot of pollinators, but the Douglas aster attracted just as many in terms of quantity. But then when you look at variety of species, lavender, I believe, attracted something like 6 or 9 unique species, and the Douglas aster attracted 74 unique pollinator species. So it just blew the lavender out of the water. So if there is one native flower you could add to your garden that's going to do the most in terms of attracting blooming for a really long time and attracting the highest number of unique pollinator species to your garden, it would be the Douglas aster. And my hope would be that it's going to pop up in a few native plant sales that are coming up soon. I know that the local sale here I believe has already happened. But if you're not familiar with the Native Plant Society chapter for the Skagit, it's called Salal. And I believe their online sale is this coming week. I want to say it starts on Thursday morning at 9 a.m. It's on my calendar because they do sell out of stuff, each year. I have stuff in my cart and I go to check out and it's gone. And I'm on there at 9 a.m. But they always have a wonderful selection, and then pickup is about a month from now, and it's at the WSU extension as you drive into Mount Vernon. It's really fun if you've never been to their garden there. It's a really fun place to visit too. So I'm hoping those are going to be on their plant sale list this coming week. But yeah, it's just a absolutely fantastic flower to add to your garden. So here's a case study for a really plant-focused thinking outside the box. And the first thing we did with thinking outside the box on this garden is that the raised beds are actually these low stone walls that you see right next to the path. So if you look at the plan view, it's this area over on your left. You can see the stones that define kind of this arc shape, and then the pathway, the 2 pathways that bisect it and actually create 4 areas. So these are essentially, as you're walking along the path, it is a raised bed, but then when you walk up into the garden, they're in-ground beds, I would say. And we've created pathways that bisect the garden into 4 parts, with one little upper area nestled into the corner by the house there, which is where we grow our heat loving things like tomatoes. But this was all just a lawn. And our clients, this was another project I did with the Seattle Urban Farm Company, and my first big project where I said, we're not doing raised beds, not drawing another rectangle on a plan. And because look at the shape of this yard, it's really organic. It's got all this flow to it. How do we work with that instead of against it? And so the first thing we did was create these beds out of stone and bring in a bunch of great soil and compost for them. And then we ran this pathway with the 2x2 architectural slab pavers through the garden that bring you from the steps on one side all the way around to a lower door in the house on the other side of the garden. And this client had a really, he's not a chef, but had really similar goals in terms of the other client with massive greenhouse. They wanted a garden surrounded by beneficial flowers and native plants. But look at how differently these turned out. I mean, this was a very, very plant focused garden. So along the path here, you've got in the foreground here, you're seeing a raspberry trellis, but then it's got a dahlia right next to it. So we're really combining a lot of different things as you flow through the garden. Then on the other side of the path, you can see you've got a fig tree and sunflowers, and then you actually start getting into the crops there right along the low stone wall. And there is a shadier part of the garden in the back where a lot of those, that's where I started creating the shade lists for both edible perennials and beneficial perennials, was for this garden a decade ago, because we had we didn't want to stop this beautiful flow and layout of plants too abruptly. We wanted all those same goals of incorporating native plants, incorporating native or edible perennials and beneficial perennials. And so we just kept it going right into the corner where we switched to those couple of pages in the glossary where you see things that work in the shade. And so that's the very far end on your right there is where it gets a lot shadier over there. But we still planted it out with a bunch of things that serve the same purpose. Yes.
So you said this was previously all lawn.
Yes.
One, how did you get rid of the lawn? And two, how did you keep the lawn from coming back?
Great questions. Gail's questions were confirming that this was all lawn before. How did we get rid of the lawn, and how did we keep it from coming back? We rented a sod cutter for this, and sod cutters will cut, I believe it's the 4-inch root mass of the lawn out. So it took us an entire day with a crew of cutting it out and rolling it up and putting it in the truck, and it was heavy. Especially because it was not so dry at that point in time in the year. And we had to carry everything up the stairs. But so the sod cutter made very quick and easier work out of it. Definitely sped up the process. And that really is the key, like making sure you typically grass roots are about 4 inches deep. So if you are removing grass, definitely go 4 inches, maybe 6 to be safe. And then we just really, then we hand dug some edges where the lawn was. There were some existing garden beds, like you can see the taller perennial shrubs in the background there, the rhodies and an awful laurel back there, some other things. So we kept that. So once we were on that side of the garden, we were out of the lawn. But then we did use, landscape fabric, definitely under the whole path. Not in all the garden beds, but in some areas that we were concerned about, we did put down fabric. Obviously, there's no fabric in the raised beds. But yeah, there were a few places where we were worried about things growing in where we used a little bit of fabric. And definitely under the path. Because it would have loved to pop back up under there. But the real key I find is just making sure you get as many of the roots out as possible, but then it's any edge condition where it's going to become really hard. You know, up against either the edge of a patio or where it could have crept under pavers in particular, that can be tricky, but we were lucky to have it be a pretty blank slate. So we got to take out almost everything that was there to start. And then all of the raised beds we were working up. And so any roots that might be there are under anywhere from 18 inches to 36 inches of soil. So hopefully there's, I mean, I'm sure there's still some grass trying to get in here and there, and I'm sure it seeds in from other places. But the sod cutter, I don't know, I'm sure you can rent one somewhere in the Skagit Valley, but it yeah, definitely helps to get rid of the lawn. So just to recap quickly, the main design concepts for integrating your edible garden into its surrounding landscape. Think spatially about both built elements and plants, address both vertical and horizontal planes, try to soften edges and ground larger and tall elements. And think about the roles that plants can play outside of the raised beds, using edible perennials, beneficial perennials, and native plants for pollinator habitat. Thank you so much.